I just remember thinking that that wasn't for me. I remember not feeling like the big tech thing was for me, or that it was like unachievable. It kind of just seemed like this thing that was out there. And people like me didn't really do that. People like me stayed in my hometown, didn't really go outside of their comfort zone, didn't really challenge themselves. And so that was kind of for a different type of person. And then there just came a certain point, due to just some personal things that happened, that caused me to sort of second guess a lot of my preconceived notions about myself and where I was coming from and where I was going. I had this realization that like I can actually try to do some of these harder things. Like there's no reason why I can't make a decision to take that process seriously. And I remember very distinctly that that was like a point in time when I was like, okay, I want to get into big tech, or I knew I wanted to go bigger with my career, and big tech was a clear way to do that. And I was like, it might take me 4 years, and I might have to go back to like a junior position, but I want to do it anyway. Like it's going to be worth it, to get to that level. And that was like a major, major mindset shift for me, because I wasn't like waiting around anymore for like something to fall into my lap. I was like actively pursuing something specific, and it didn't have to be 4 years later. It was like 6 months later. Because what happened was I started doing the things that I knew I needed to do. Like up until that point, algorithms and data structures and that kind of thing, I had a big resistance to it, because I felt like, first of all, I didn't know it, and that was threatening to me. So I kind of like devalued it, like I like pushed it away, because, oh, you don't really need that in the job anyway. And I kind of had a chip on my shoulder, right, in that regard, where I've done real projects. I've actually provided value to people. Like I don't need to learn data structures and algorithms. I remember seeing a post about there's a really, really popular tool in the dev community called Homebrew, which is basically like a package installer for Mac. And I guess the guy who created Homebrew, he went and interviewed at Google and failed the Google interview. And he was tweeting about it, and he's like, literally, I write software that every single person in this company, like every single engineer uses, and you're failing me. But it's because like he didn't follow the process. He didn't like put himself under the process that everybody has to go through. When I first saw his tweet, I was like, oh, that's so terrible. Like, oh, like why would you, that doesn't make any sense. Google should just like change their processes or whatever. But then I realized, like, when you're a company like that, you have to weed people out. Like that's the only way that you can actually hire. So that's what this process is, the data structures and algorithms thing, which are the computer science fundamentals. And I had to take that chip off my shoulder and be like, okay, I have to dig into this, and I have to understand it. And then the second thing was, I had to get good at behavioral interviews. One thing that I'm remembering now that I'm thinking about it is I actually interviewed for a company in Seattle, like way back at the start of my freelance career. And I got on this interview, and I failed the interview because it was a behavioral question. I gave a blasé, like non-specific answer, and I got pushback on it, and I wasn't expecting that. And I got really kind of like grumpy and upset that like, my sort of like blasé answer wasn't accepted or wasn't good enough. But the truth of the matter was, like, I didn't do my homework on the process. I didn't prepare in the way that I needed to prepare. And I hadn't thought deeply about some of these, career stories, right? And so at that point in time, like, I didn't use that opportunity to take the chip off my shoulder. I think like I had a bigger chip on my shoulder after that. I was like, oh, that's, I don't want to work for companies. Like they have weird interview policies. They have weird interview questions that don't really mean anything. And when I made the decision to actually change the course of my career, I had to take that chip off, and I had to start thinking deeply about, what my value has been. Where have I been a good team player? Where haven't I been a good team player? And I had to really, really think long and hard about the projects that I had completed, actually like backward looking for the first time in my career. And I think that was scary, because like there were things I didn't like, there was failure, right? There was There were things that I didn't necessarily want to go rehearse and think about and think through that happened, or things, or behavioral things where I could have been more professional, or I could have done something better, right? But there just came this realization at a certain point that like I can't, like I have to square up to that stuff at some point if I want to, grow, if I want to move forward. Once that was clear, the work became, once I wasn't afraid to do the work itself is pretty straightforward. It's not so much like, it's almost not so much like the work itself. It's kind of the resistance to the work, I think, that I really had to overcome. And there was a pride thing there for sure. There was a um, which the deep root of that was insecurity, right? So I had to deal with all that stuff, and I also had to deal with some debilitating anxiety that I hadn't really squared up to as well. So when I asked myself the question, what would it look like to get into big tech? What type of person would I need to be to actually get into big tech? When I looked at that question honestly, there were several glaring gaps of things that I had to address. So yeah, that's kind of like the first thing that I think about. And like up to that point in my career, I worked on really cool things. I'd worked with really cool people. I generally enjoyed what I was doing, but I definitely had kind of this chip on my shoulder because I was self-taught, because I did the freelance thing, and that really really held me back. I think it helped me go quickly at first, right? Like it helped me ramp up really quickly, and it's good to have like that drive and that ownership, but at a certain point you hit a ceiling if you're not willing to consider, really consider like what your gaps are, and what would it look like to achieve this thing that you maybe didn't imagine you're good enough for,
Hmm. So
or not so much that you're not good enough for it, but like it's kind of overblown, and like the people that are good enough to do it, they're just good enough at these few, kind of random things that aren't even that important. So sort of devaluing the process. Um, yeah.
yeah, and it's interesting because hiring is a unique process that is different from actually working and doing a certain job. And a lot of times it's so frustrating, you just would rather ignore what do you have to learn to go through this unique process. And essentially, you could go years or your whole life just like doing different jobs, staying at a certain level, making certain amount of money, but maybe not as much as you could because you just don't want to participate in this process that honestly is not that long, right? Like interviewing is not years, right? Your job will be years, right? Your career will be years. But interviewing is really a few months. It's really a couple months studying something, looking back at, your work, fine tuning certain communication stories, right? So it's interesting how as you start to move around in your career, you actually see that it's really not about you 100%. And figuring out a way to kind of break up that feeling of, oh, I did these things, doesn't that qualify me? Like, no, because there's a certain process, and that process is not 100% based on what you did in the past. It's also trust building. It's also maybe doing some technical work you haven't done before. Maybe it's learning or certifying for a new skill that requires, that. So it's interesting how in the beginning, it could be 100% about your drive, right? And about like your ambition. But after that, it's like, how do you integrate that with the processes that exist? How do you look at something from a company's perspective?
I think that's what it is. In order to be a successful interviewer, you have to see things from the hiring point of view, and you have to be patient with that perspective, and you have to see its value, right? And the value is that you're going to be working on a team of people, and you have to see their perspective. You have to be able to step out of your shoes for a second and see that like this person interviewing me doesn't know me from Adam. They have no context. There's no reason why they might not be interviewing someone and that person might be like a total weirdo who would be a terrible hire. And they have to do their part to make sure that they're hiring the right people, right? So you have to just kind of take the chip off your shoulder and look at the process from the company's perspective, from the hiring perspective. And I think that really will be a critical thing as you sort of warm up to the idea of putting yourself underneath some of these like preparation processes as you prepare for this, this interview thing that I know a lot of people get grumpy about it, right? Or they have resistance to it. But the fact of the matter is, it's there for a reason. It's a way for companies to evaluate you in a short amount of time to see if you have the problem solving skills within a computer science context and that you're a good person to work with from a behavioral perspective. So once you see that, you start to look at your career and everything that you've done through that lens, you'll start to see that you do have like a lot of good things to talk about, right? You
Yeah.
just have to kind of sit in that for a while and think about it.
And what's interesting is in the olden days, before the internet, people would have like letters, others would give them, referring them, right? So they would be like actual referral letters. And you would come into someone's office and you would hand them maybe a resume and like a letter you wrote and maybe some referrals from other people. And, you know, this would work because there was no internet. There was like no other way to communicate. But today, we have so much that we can do and we don't even realize it to get ahead of the process of building trust, especially on the behavioral side of just like, this is a person that's can do the job and work with others and like knows what teamwork is. And that's where leveraging the relationships and building a personal brand and just like being online, even if it's not every day, you don't have to. Just once a week, once every 2 weeks, just share your opinions. You can even have a blog. You don't even have to like post on LinkedIn. Like there's many ways you could show up, but there's ways you can get ahead of that relationship building, at least for the behavioral side. On the technical side, there is really no way to move around that. Like the company needs to know that you're technically able to do certain things that they require. So it's like if you were a woodworker and you wanted a senior woodworker position, but you didn't want to do a test of building something or you didn't have something to show, like, of course you would have to come in with some experience if you wanted that level of pay and responsibility. So in software engineering, it is a highly technical field. Like you are paid for your ability to understand the technical concepts and have like the context to solve them.
That's right. And I think you also have to look at sort of the benefits of some of these more technical interviews where you have sort of the data structure and algorithm type questions. Oftentimes when you're interviewing for a company that's utilizing that sort of hiring process, they're not going to necessarily look at what technologies you've specifically worked on because they understand that it's more about the problem solving, it's more about the mental models, it's more about your ability to learn technical things. And that's the nice thing about sort of this style of interview that people kind of get grumpy about is it's sort of agnostic to the specific technologies. It's demonstrating your ability to problem solve with really any kind of programming language or platform or anything like that.
So what I'm very interested about is that area of resistance where you feel almost entitled to the job because you have done that kind of work before. And I know we've all been in that situation. How do you even recognize that that's what's happening? I feel like when you're in that place, you're so zoomed in to this feeling and actual real life knowledge that I've done this kind of stuff before, right? Like, maybe big tech isn't your route. That's perfectly fine too. But if big tech is your route, or, finding a senior developer role from mid-level or engineering lead from senior role or whatever it is that you're going towards, like, you will have to go through a process. So how do you recognize and maybe one thing that helps you work through the resistance?
That's a really, really good question. I think primarily if you have some kind of sounding board, if you have someone who can kind of look into your situation, they'll be able to tell you. But if we say this, like if we say, oh, you might need some mentorship, and your response to that is no thanks, then I can already tell you that you have that resistance, that you have that chip on your shoulder. And I don't know if there's a magical way to kind of get rid of that, but I think like you're not if you're wondering if you're sort of in this place of resistance, you're probably on your way out of it, right? Because you're starting to see it a little bit. If you're in this place of resistance, you're not going to be asking yourself that question, probably. So if you're contemplating this, good. You're in a good spot. You're in a better spot than you were when you weren't.
So let's
So
talk
that
to someone who is contemplating
yeah.
moving into something more meaningful and fulfilling with more money that makes more sense for the longer term. What do you do in that place when you recognize, okay, I want to take some next steps? What does that mean?
Yeah, I think the first step is to truly understand or truly be willing to start at zero. In terms of your experience, what you've worked on, there's tons of value in what you've worked on, but you have to understand that it all needs to be reframed. You have to first kind of tear down before you can build up, right? So, what do I mean by that? Instead of starting with all of the projects that you've done that you're super proud of and kind of trying to think about whether or not you're qualified based on that, basically start with the qualifications, start with the requirements and the types of stories that have actually gotten people hired and the types of people who have actually gotten hired, and tearing down in your own mind sort of everything that you've done and then rebuilding it from that new perspective, right? And you're gonna see, there are projects, there are things that happened in your career that you were totally not thinking about before that are going to be super important, for your interview process. And there are going to be some projects that you thought were just like baller, that you were super, super proud of, that aren't going to be as important. So you have to understand that when you're trying to get to another level, when you're trying to stand out, you have to really do the work of taking the chip off your shoulder fully. And if you're in sort of this middle place, let me tell you that it's a good place to be on the other side of that. So keep going. The thing about this process is that you're going to understand your value more holistically anyway by going through it. And you're going to understand your technical gaps more holistically anyway, which will help you in your career, will help you in your trajectory, regardless of whether or not you get into, a big company, for instance. You will become a more effective communicator. You will become a more effective technical person. You will become a more effective engineer just by going through this process. So that's what I'd say. You have to tear down before you can build up.
Yeah. So if I understood you correctly, it's important to really rework a lot of your ideas and beliefs around what projects are really important to talk about based on the new roles that you're going for, what contributions that could be communication based, could be technical based, leadership based, whatever it is, like reframing a lot of these stories. So what comes to mind for me is getting to that next level, or whatever that level looks like for you, will require a reworking of everything that you've done so far, because you're essentially, leveling up. And that means the package of the new you will look different. So this package has to be reworked based on a deep evaluation of what you've done and restructuring things. So if you've been, mid-level engineer for a couple of years and you've had great projects, you've had some good teams, things like that, you probably want to reevaluate, how does this look when you're a senior or a lead or running your own business, something like that. So this new package takes time to rework. It's kind of like if a business is rebranding or creating a new product, you're re-strategizing, right? And you may be taking some of what you already built and building on top of that, but it will look different to the people who are going to buy this new product. So essentially, you're creating a whole new you.
That's exactly right. Yep. I love the rebranding sort of parallel there and the word strategy. It's not that like all of the content is different per se, but truly just like the way it's packaged, right? The way that you're thinking about it. And it's really you taking on the perspective of the hiring team, right? And truly, or the hiring team, or if you're going for promotion, whoever is promoting you, right? You're taking on their perspective and looking at everything you've done through that lens, and making sure that you're not distorting the lens at all with some pride that's left over or that chip on the shoulder, right? Which is where the mentorship can be helpful.
Yeah, I feel like if you've heard this term, a lot of life is optics, like politics, right? It's mainly optics, right? We don't know the lives these people lead, but in the public space, they look a certain way. Celebrities create a certain look out in public, right? Everyone has like a certain brand if they post online. So a lot of times what we see frames how we understand someone is the only thing of who they are, right? They could be a completely different person, honestly. Hopefully, there's some alignment between what you're presenting and what your life is like. But the optics of what other people see you as and what you're presenting and how they perceive it, that's really what matters in terms of like moving up, creating an ecosystem, creating leverage, things like that. So again, it can't be all about you. There has to be an alignment with how you're showing up for others and your values and goals.
Yeah, yeah. That's exactly right.
So maybe there's an interesting story around when you started to take the time to actually figure out, what do I do to apply to Amazon and other companies? What did that time look like for you?
Yeah. So I'm kind of thinking about two different things that happened. The first one is that I realized that there was like nothing stopping me from just kind of reaching out and applying to places. And then also thinking deeply about, once I realized that I was going to have to, and sort of remembering, the failure that I had previously in my like behavioral interviews, sort of realizing that I needed to think deeply about that. And one thing that really surprised me is some of the things that I was embarrassed about in my career, or some of the failures, ended up being really, really strong behavioral stories that ended up helping me get hired, because the way that I was able to tell those stories had a lot to do with like the response to the failure, or sort of, what the action items were after the failure, or how I treated the person that I let down or whatever. Those are critical stories. And those often are the ones that kind of get you, where they're like, what, if you get asked a question like, tell me about a time you received some really hard feedback where someone didn't like what you did. You're like, oh, I wasn't really prepared to answer that question, because I thought that I was just supposed to talk about all the things I did well, But I think that really, going in deep and realizing, that it's not just your successes, your successful projects that are important for, leveling up. It's understanding where you failed and how you handled those failures and like what you learned from them.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that was like one thing that really surprised me, was like, that stuff's valuable too. And so those stories kind of like lived in the shadows in the back of my head. I didn't really like to think about them, but they ended up serving like a really valuable purpose, like in the interview process, and in sort of the process leading up to those interviews too, while I was preparing.
So what I'm hearing is definitely look into your failures, document them, have an inventory, and prepare to talk about learnings from them, and even talk about them publicly, because people find value in actually learning what other people did, like as a mistake, or maybe something they would have done better, or something different.
Yep, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. I remember specifically there was a story that I told during one of my interviews that I was really not stoked to tell. And basically, what happened was, when I was working on a really big project for a client, and they were sort of staging content on the project. It was like a custom, it's like a kind of a big website for a big company. And there was like a membership portal that was like custom built or whatever. But then there was also all this like content that they were porting over. And I dropped the database. Like the site wasn't live yet, but there was a ton of work that got lost. And I had to call the president of this company and tell them what I did. And it was not that, obviously, like, that conversation was not fun. And it was an awful experience to go through, but um I had to call the stakeholder and let them know that, like, their work was lost. I had to offer solutions on, like, how I could help, get all the content back over. And I also took several learnings from that, like, even on a staging database, right, that a customer is working on, setting up automatic backups that weren't previously there, right? So that story, that's like a very short version of the story, but that ended up that still is a story that I would potentially use in an interview. Um, I think shows, obviously, like, it was, the failure was big enough to cause impact, right? Like, it impacted somebody else that had, invested their time into, porting this content over. And so it was which shows that it's an important project. And thankfully that project ended up being successful. Um, but yeah, even like in the successful projects, there's often things that happen that are not good, that you can learn from, that you can uh, show up to, even after you made a mistake that causes someone else a lot of pain. And um, that's often where you kind of can separate yourself, because, like, the type of person that would handle that in a bad way, after they did the failure, you could blame, you could kind of sneak your way around it, you could, go try to do it all yourself and, like, kind of, try to get yourself out of trouble, or you could square up to it and, admit what you did wrong and learn from it. And so, yeah, like, that's one example that is kind of a fun one to tell people.
Yeah. And what's interesting is, one thing, don't take for granted the way you responded, because something that I used to do a lot in the past is take for granted the fact that I was naturally organized. I would naturally communicate well. I wrote good emails. I still do. Now I
Yeah.
write good DMs. I take that for granted because that came naturally for me. And it was much easier for me to build that skill than other people because I already had a natural ability. But, like, it's a skill. Anyone can learn it if they put time into it. So don't take for granted the way you responded, and you realize that, right? Because you pointed out a couple of other responses that could have happened. So
Right.
definitely acknowledge, like, exactly how you responded and understand how that was appropriate or not appropriate, and kind of how you want to frame that. And the second thing is, in a way, if you're talking about these stories that really focus on learnings, you can have a lot of your answers in an interview, especially behavioral or even some technical. If there's some, like, big technical failures that you had, you could lead with them, right? And I bet you've seen that really successful in the interviews you did, because people actually want to know, like, how do you react in situations that really require taking responsibility? Like, they want to know, can I trust you? Will you take responsibility for your work, and will you work with others? But overall, it's all about, like, how responsible is this person? Like, literally, how much of a response they will have to something, right? What is their ability to have an appropriate response given the situation, given what is required in the events that happened? And I feel like that's really
Right.
hard to learn when you're just meeting someone, right? So that's
Right.
where, like, personal branding, talking about yourself, having a blog, really owning up to both your successes, wins, whatever in between, just events in your work and life. Literally talk about how you showed a response to certain situations, right? But if it's, like, sort of a failure, like a mistake that happened, that's an even bigger impact that you're making with that story.
Hmm. I would argue it's a bigger opportunity to distinguish yourself from other candidates.
Yeah.
Everyone loves to talk about their successes. Everyone likes to
Mm-hmm.
talk about how they won.
New interview strategy, only talk about your failures.
If you can show that you have taken ownership of your failures and you've learned from them, and the energy that you present is confident in doing that, that is a really, really strong showing, because it shows that you truly understand at a deep level that growth comes from hard things. Growth comes from
Mm-hmm.
failure often.
Yeah, that's how
And
you show it.
you're not going to be, when you get on the team and something happens, you're not going to be trying to blame people. You're not going to be trying to get out of it. So if you think about your failures, like right now, think about one or two times that you're kind of embarrassed, maybe you don't even like to think about. Maybe it's time to actually go face those things and to think
Mm-hmm.
about them deeply and to kind of like digest them a little bit more, so that when they come up, you don't have this like reaction
Mm-hmm.
to them, where you're kind of like a little bit cagey in talking about them, or you're like a little bit cagey and
Yeah.
rehearsing sort of the details of that event.
Especially if you were actually responsible and, as far as you understand, responded as appropriately as you could in that situation. Or even if you look back now and you're like, I could have responded better. That was like not the greatest response. That's okay. You could actually be
Yeah.
honest and say, listen, I did this in this situation. And now that I'm thinking about it, like, I would have done this other thing, which would be a more appropriate response. Like, that's totally fine, because, again, it's about showcasing that you are learning from any past experiences and that you will bring that attitude of learning and continuing to try to be responsible in the new team, essentially. I mean, that's kind of like what teamwork is, right? That everyone should
Yeah.
go through just like a Slack test of like, how do you communicate on Slack? That would be funny.
Yeah. 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 Um, yeah, I think it's a really good call out that you don't, whenever you're thinking about your failures, it's not like you have to have a failure where you then responded well in real time to the failure. I think it can be in retrospect. You're thinking about it today and you're thinking about, how you've grown since then, sort of
Mm-hmm.
what you would do differently and how you would handle that now. And that can show growth too. So it doesn't have to be, it can be a true failure end to end, where not only you fail, but you also respond badly. And hopefully
Yeah.
you were able to rebuild that trust eventually somehow, with whoever you were working with, or not, but hopefully you've grown since then, you've learned from it, and you've squared up to that instance and that event, and you've thought deeply about it and understood like where you go from there. And
Yeah.
yeah.
So what I'm hearing is, as you're repackaging yourself metaphorically and really thinking about past experiences, it's really important to bring out all the experiences, and especially the ones where you felt like really embarrassed or you really don't want to talk about it. Like, those could be actually the most impactful and create the best opportunities. And in fact, like, if you're sharing any of your life on LinkedIn, social media, or blogs and stuff, like, if you start talking publicly about these experiences from the perspective of, this is how I learned, and this is what I would have done differently, or this is what happened, like, those are amazing opportunities. People love to react and kind of come together and support you when you do share those kind of learnings. So don't think that that's just, something you want to keep in the background. Oftentimes, the things in the background are the things that are most valuable to bring up. And when you start doing like an inventory, right, of all your experiences, relationships, jobs, stuff like that, you can actually pick out like a thread of, okay, what's the main message that I want to give people.
Yeah. I think like posting your stories is a great way to also just get used to talking about your failures. Like, it's a
That's a
great
great
way to
start,
sort of,
right?
yeah,
It's
like you
public.
can,
It's writing
yes,
skills, communication. You're going to get comments. It's great. It has everything.
yep, yep. And you're going to see that there's value in it, like for other people too. And get that, yeah, like get that practice, like get that exposure. And then when it comes time to like, do the interview and answer the hard questions, like it's going to be no big deal because you've already like made it a practice to talk about those things.
Mm-hmm.
And any of your behavioral stories that you would use in an interview would likely be, as long as it's not like naming names or whatever, or you're exposing somebody, would likely be like great LinkedIn posts to talk about your